There could be many reasons that your drums don't sound the way you want them to, but after this video, you won't have to wonder if it's your EQ moves, because we're going to give you all the most important things that you need to know and a clear system that you can actually use, so you can EQ your drums to sound the way you want them to. So here's what we're going to cover: common questions and biggest mistakes, what to do before EQ, key frequencies for drums and cymbals, the drum EQ blueprint, and action items. So you're going to walk away from this lesson with some things to download, some practice multi-tracks, so that you can implement what you learn here today. Okay? We don't want to just absorb. We want to absorb and then implement. So let's start with common questions. Why should you EQ drums? First question, just very basic, level 0. And I've got a few points here, and then Chris, you can jump in if you have anything to add, but just kind of like high level: to remove unwanted and or distracting frequencies, to enhance the sound, and to help them cut through the mix. Those are kind of like the three main things. Would you agree? Do you have anything to add?
Totally, man. Totally. It's that same principle that we always come back to, which is just fixing problems and then enhancing, right?
Yep.
So it's just those two things. If that's what needs to be done, that's when you do it. And if it doesn't need to be done, you don't have to do it.
So when should you EQ drums? And I've got a couple different sections here. One, during recording and production, right? So when you're tracking drums, if you're going through like outboard gear and stuff like that, or you're going through channel strips and you have EQ available to you to just kind of like sculpt the sound, then that's kind of like a common time to do that, right? Inside of production, let's say you're working with MIDI drums or samples primarily, and you want to sculpt the sound there in sound design. Basically, this is what we call like a part of sound design. You can use it there, right? And then during mixing, and this is really what we're going to focus on today. We're going to give you this blueprint or the system to use when you're actually mixing your drums. But anything to add to that?
That makes total sense. One is a little more stylistic in its approach. So in the recording production phase, it's having a very specific vision and then executing that with tone in mind using EQ, right? And then the other part of it is enhancing or fixing any problems that you've picked up during the recording phase. But during the recording phase, if you can fix it by moving the mic, by changing the placement, then absolutely do that, right?
Exactly. That's your first form of EQ, is that mic placement for sure. So should I EQ MIDI drums and samples? And this is basically kind of like looping back around to what Chris said just like a couple minutes ago, right? So no, if they already sound the way that you want them to sound, but yes, if they don't.
Totally.
Right? We're talking about making moves based on intention, right? You have to have a why. You got to know why you're going to be making those moves in the first place. And it's not just like, oh, I heard somewhere that I should EQ my drums, so how do I do it? It's more the mindset of like, what's the sound that I want? What's the sound that I'm going for? And how do I use EQ as a tool to get there? Make sense?
100%. Don't EQ your drums just because someone told you to. Do it if you need to.
Right. Yeah. The drum EQ trick that works every time. It's not like that.
On every kick drum in every mix scenario.
Yeah.
Probably not, right?
Right. Let's talk about biggest mistakes. So I've got a few things here, and then anything you want to add, Chris. Number 1, thinking EQ will fix poor recording and sound selection, right? So getting a great drum sound starts with getting a great performance on a great sounding kit in a great room with great recording technique. All these little pieces of the puzzle, they come in first. This is before anything else. It's not fix it in the mix mentality. It's get it right at the source, right? The better you get it at the source, the easier your life is going to be down the line, right? That's where everything starts. And the loose guideline that I like to go by, I don't know if you do this, Chris, but my loose guideline is during the recording or production phase, I like to aim to get my drums 80% of the way to their final sound.
Yeah. I would go even further. I know this is just about drums, but in the whole area of production, is to try to get the song to sound 80% of the way there. So that's all the little nuanced decisions that you make, from sound selection to recording, the mic placement, the tone that you want to go for overall, like generally, and also specifically within each of your elements. We're already thinking with the end in mind, right? And
Totally.
that's kind of what it just comes back to. We know it's going to get mixed, we know it's going to get mastered. So how can we make steps to prevent any issues later down that chain?
Yeah, exactly. Next biggest mistake, EQing without a clear goal in mind. Again, we talked about that on the last slide, right? Every move should have a clear intention or a why behind it. We don't have to, I don't think we have to drill that anymore. I think you guys probably
No.
get it.
Intention, intention, intention.
Yeah, why? Start
Yeah.
with why.
Yeah,
And
totally.
then EQing drums in solo, another big mistake, right? Like, I think it's okay to check in solo. You know, sometimes it's cool, but context matters most. You know, and that's what I have here. What matters is how the drums sound together and in context with the rest of the mix. That's what matters.
Yeah.
I had the worst sounding like soloed snare drum the other day, but in combination with the overheads and the room mics, and I had like a crotch mic or a knee mic, or it's got some other names that we won't get into right now. But but all of those piled together equaled the snare sound, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, the snare and solo was terrible, but all together, excuse me, all together, it sounded great. So, and that's what matters. That's how people are gonna hear the music.
Yeah, totally. Context, right? So important. And it's a real big mistake. That, I'm not gonna lie, I did that. I used to try and mix a lot of things in solo, and it sounded great in solo and then fell apart in the context, right? And we're thinking about the relationships between each of these elements as an overall presentation of the entire song. So we don't want to make decisions based on how one thing sounds on its own. We want to see how the relationships are interacting with each other. So it's super important.
Yeah, totally. So I've got a few things here on what to do before EQ. All right, number one, know your target. Right, so collect your references to help guide your EQ moves. And when we talk about references, we're talking about just a model, something for you to shoot for, right? Other professionally released tracks that you can bring into your DAW or just kind of play on Spotify or whatever, however you want to do it. But something that you can compare back and forth to. So you have something, you know, some kind of anchor, and you're not just kind of shooting blindly in the dark, right? That's a great way, at least up until you build your instincts for this kind of stuff, using references just across the board, not just for drums, but for anything. You know, anything you're doing in product, whether it's in the production stage or the mixing stage or the mastering stage, whatever, like having references, super, super important. So if you're not doing that, for sure, get started, you know, yesterday. And I think a healthy mindset to have here is to ballpark and not to copy, right? The idea is not to copy your references exactly. I think a lot of people, when they first start using references, kind of get stuck in this trap where they're trying to copy things exactly. They're trying to play the precision game, but the reality is not all drums are created equal. Not all sounds and mixes are created equal. And you do have to think about what works best in the context of the mix and what serves the song the best. It's not just about copying individual sounds and then plopping them into your arrangement. That's a good way for things to sound really disjointed, right?
Totally.
So it is something to kind of keep you on track, right? And create boundaries around what you should and shouldn't do, or what you're kind of like aiming to do with your sound. Anything to add to that?
Just don't get into that vicious cycle of trying to make it sound the same. Different recordings, different artists, different days, all of those things you have to take into consideration, different taste. So just get it in a ballpark. Get it somewhere where you go, yep, this could be on a playlist with this song. It's in a similar kind of realm. Move on.
That's my favorite way to think about it is, will this song sit in a playlist well, with a bunch of other songs in the similar genre, right?
Mhm.
I love to think about it that way. Next, what to do before EQ? Get a volume balance. I used to do this. I used to just like actually throw up a kick drum and then just start like EQing it and compressing it before I even had anything else. And then I'd bring up the snare and I'd start EQing and compressing it before I had anything else in the mix. But what I found is that just getting a strong volume balance is the key here. Getting that foundational balance and making those drums fit in with the rest of the mix is like the solid starting point. And it looks like I have nothing underneath this. Get a volume balance. I've just like copied these over. But anything to
So
add to
what we
that,
should
Chris?
say, yeah, is get a volume balance based on your references. Again, it's the same principle. It's like do things instinctually, get a rough volume balance, then bring in your reference and see where you're at. Again, it's not a precision game. We're just trying to get things in a ballpark, but we're looking at what's the relationship between the kick and the snare? What's the relationship between the snare and the overheads? What's the relationship to the toms? And how are they panned out as well? So we can kind of match that and do that and then get it close. Okay, it sounds like this. These drums could be placed on a playlist with these three references. Like they're in a similar ballpark, just based off of volume. So it's the same principle, but we're just thinking about how can we mitigate any unnecessary complexity and just use our faders to do the majority of the work. And it just goes back to context, right? Instead of bringing the kick up and then going, oh, but I want more punch from the kick and starting to, put a transient shaper on there. Oh, I want more thump, so I'll use an EQ to do that. And then bringing the snare. You might not need that in the context of everything else with your room mics, with your overheads, with your knee mic. You might get what you need from those just with volume, just with blending those in. So yeah, it's just same principle, references have some level of objectivity, but don't obsess over trying to get them exactly the same.
Well said. Oh no. Here, this is what we're
Oh
gonna do.
no.
Oh no. Here, this is what we're gonna do. I'm gonna change that on the slide. We're gonna go.
Sweet.
We're gonna say use your references to help guide your volume moves.
Sweet.
Makes more sense, right? And then third, what to do before EQ? Check phase relationships between your drums. This is basically your low-hanging fruit when it comes to EQ. And what we do here is phase align multi-mic'd drums to avoid frequency cancellation. So what happens is when you have multiple mic'd drums, like a kick drum that has a mic on the inside of the drum and a mic on the outside of the drum, right? A kick in and a kick out. The signal is reaching those mics at different times. So that time delay can cause phase cancellation. So what does that mean in terms of the sound? It could make the drum sound a little bit thinner, a little bit hollow, right? So by phase aligning everything, you'll get maximum kind of punch and fullness out of those drums. So things to look out for, and maybe I'll demonstrate this in a moment, but things to look out for here, multi-mic'd kicks and multi-mic'd snares.
Say that 3 times really fast.
I know. But usually there's a snare top, snare bottom. On kicks, it's not uncommon for kick in, kick out, and sub, right? Sometimes you'll even get 3. So those are the ones that are going to make the most difference, right? They're going to have the most impact on the sound of the drums. Aligning to overheads and room mics will give you kind of like a little less depth and more tightness, right? I don't really tend to go that route, especially with room mics, right? So what some people will do, for example, is they'll align all of their kick drum mics and then align all of their snare drum mics and then align those individual close mics to the overheads,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which I've found has just less impact, like minimal impact. It's less noticeable than it is just aligning the drums to themselves. You know, it's kind of your decision to make. You have to experiment with it and see what kind of sound you like. For room mics, aligning to room mics, for me, I never do it. Because what's the point of the room mic in the first place? It's the distance. It's to create that
Totally.
space, and it's to create that ambience around the drum kit. So aligning all the transients with each other to the room mics, you know, a little too tight sounding, a little too rigid sounding, and unnatural sounding for me personally. But
Yeah,
as always, you need to run your own experiments and come to your own conclusions there. Does that make sense,
100%.
Chris?
Yeah, totally, totally.
Yeah. And then I've got just kind of like last point here, aligning initial transients on layered samples can also make a difference here. Even if you're dragging in samples that don't have the same fundamental frequencies or anything like that, like you're layering 2 or 3 kick drums on top of each other, right? Still trying to get as close as you can to lining up those initial transients can give you the fullness and that punch that you might otherwise be lacking if the transients don't quite line up, right? And let me
Yep.
show you what I'm talking about here. Let's jump into the DAW, and if we take a look and just zoom into like this kick in track, and we can clearly see that these are out of phase now,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if we zoom in here,
Kick subs coming in a touch later than
exactly,
kick in.
right? So if we have this cursor here, whoop, you can see it. We're later here. So what do you do in that scenario? You could just simply drag this region over. And now you can see that the transients are hitting on the same dip. They're aligning there, and then the peaks aligning there, dip, peak, so on and so forth, right? So let me show you what this will sound like. And I am going to solo this, but only because this is a teaching demonstration.
For demonstration purposes.
It's low end. It's low end punch and that low
Totally.
end impact.
Yeah.
Right? That's what we're getting out of aligning those.
For sure.
Let's check the snare top and bottom as well. We've got this snare bottom out of phase and reverse polarity. So if I move that over, you can see that if we zoom in a little bit more, they're now lining up. I phase aligned it, but now the polarity is opposite.
Flip the opposite way. Yeah.
Right? So you can see the waveforms are going opposite directions. The dip aligns with the peak, and the peak aligns with the dip. Right? What do you do in that scenario? Just use a gain plugin and hit the phase invert. Right? So if we were to play that, let's see. Not too much of an audible difference there, probably because I have that snare bottom pretty low in the mix.
In context with the, but there is a perceived level of smack to it that we feel like we add when we invert the phase.
Let's see. I'm gonna bring it up a little bit. You can hear
Body.
it. Yeah, you can hear it much more now when we increase the volume. Right? So without the phase inverted or flipped or polarity reversed, whatever you want to call it. That's
Sounds
totally.
like a yeah.
What's
It's
that?
a fat snare. It's a fat snare now.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the way it was intended to sound, right? Again, I like to check just kicks, snares, those multi-mic'd, and then I usually call it a day. You know, I don't
Yeah.
usually align those to my overheads or rooms or anything like that. I just kind of like the sound of the depth a little bit. But again, feel free to experiment and come to your own conclusions there. No wrong way. Next, we're going to dive into some key frequencies for drums. This is going to be fun. And these are just frequency ranges to be aware of for each piece of the drum kit. Everybody's kind of got their own take on this. Yeah, this is our starting points. Use these as loose guidelines, loose starting points. These are not exact formulas or anything like that. This is more like, hey, if you're looking for this kind of sound, search somewhere in this area. If you're looking for this kind of sound on this particular drum, search somewhere in this kind of area. Make sense?
Yeah, totally. There's no hard and fast rules,
Right.
honestly. And it's frustrating because we all want the answer. It's like I just want give me the frequencies so that my drums sound great every time, but they're not going to be the same drums. They're not going to be played by the same drummer oftentimes, or they might be played by the same drummer but on a different day, who may hit them slightly differently, right? So we have to take all of that into consideration, and that's going to affect the intentionality in which you approach the way that you're EQing the drums.
Here,
So
here's
there we go.
the exception, right? If you're creating your own music, and I don't know, this might be controversial, but
Let's do it.
whatever. Controversial? Is it controversial or controversial? It's controversial.
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 I thought you were just saying controversial in a very well a posh accent, which is what
Controversial.
we would say. Controversial.
No, this might sound controversial, but if you're creating your own music and you're using the same exact drum VST every single time, and you've put the work in to sculpt that sound, and you're just going to use that for your own music over and over and over and over again and just pump stuff out, then why not? You know, there's going to
Yeah,
be,
great.
you've created basically your own preset and you've
Mhm.
created your own sound that you don't need to mess with. You can just kind of move forward with. That's what I would say would be the kind of that one size fits all
For
suggestion.
sure.
You
And
know,
I honestly, dude, I don't think that's controversial. I think it's more controversial. I think it's more if you're like what you're saying, if you know that you have a very specific sound that you're going to use in absolutely every single track that you ever do, then there's going to be that instance where you just pull up the same EQ settings every time. You maybe have a chain for your drums just to speed up that workflow for yourself. But the reason we're saying take it with a grain of salt is that more often than not, it's going to be more likely that there's going to be people that are going to be either recording multiple drummers with different drum kits in a different room, and all of those variables are going to change your approach. And it's just worth bearing that in mind if you're going to be going down that route. So that's kind of why we're really trying to drum in that intentionality.
pun intended.
Much intended.
All right, let's dig in. Key frequencies. We'll start the kick. Here's what we got: 20 to 50 hertz rumble, 50 to 120 hertz fullness, body and punch, 200 to 500 muddy, kind of like boxiness, 500 to 1K honky and bouncy, 2K to 6K attack, 7K plus click. Now, we can talk about each one of these. And I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to bring up the DAW so that we can explore all of these frequency ranges. And I am going to do this in solo again, just for demonstration purposes here. Now, I've got my kick in and my kick sub. The first thing I'm going to do here is actually bust these together and just call that kick, right? So that way I've got two tracks. They're going to a single track that I can just use EQ on and EQ that instrument as a whole. I've got my balance here, this kick in and kick sub kind of balance. The kick sub is like my low end. The kick in is a little bit more of that attack and that smack. And then we've got the snare top and snare bottom. I'm going to send those to a bus as well and just call it snare. And same idea, just multiple mics blended together to create one snare sound that we can then sculpt with EQ. So starting with the kick and exploring these frequency ranges. I'm going to do that with this 4KE because I just fell back in love with it.
Yeah.
Right. So up here we have some like filters. Okay. This 20 hertz, actually, you know what? This is not going to be the best for demonstrating this. Let me just pull up a visual EQ, just stock EQ here. So first we've got 20 to 50 hertz on a kick drum. Check this out. 20 to 50 hertz. Like, I almost can't even get it with a shelf. Like, let's see. If we boost it, let's see if you can hear that. It's like where the rumble is. And it's so like, it actually does us very little good. I mean, if I'm just being completely honest with you and just like giving you my take on this area, just I think kind of like in general, I think that's controversial for me to say that, but I just don't think it does any good on a kick drum, right? Like on most instruments, you can't like, you can feel that energy a little bit, but in my experience, it's kind of like negligible, right? So I think if there was something to high pass on a kick drum, you could probably get away with high passing this area all the way up to 50 hertz, right? Like, and that's just to save energy. It's to save headroom.
Yeah, again, we're thinking with the end in mind, right? If it's so imperceptible, why do yourself the disservice later on if you're going to have to master and bring up to loudness of having all of this imperceptible energy eating up headroom that stops you from being able to get things to loudness? Why not just get rid of that now and save yourself the hassle later on from pulling your hair out and going, oh, I can't get it to the loudness of my reference tracks? Just get rid of it.
Yeah, totally. And that's your call to make. You know, this is
totally, yeah.
Yeah, I'm
It's not a
not
hard and
saying
fast rule.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not saying do this every single time, but
Totally.
it makes sense to me to kind of like scoop all that stuff out of there.
Yeah.
Moving on to 50 hertz to 120 hertz, and we can even see on the analyzer here, that's where the fundamental of that kick is. You know, that's where all of the fullness and the body and the punch just kind of like naturally will sit on a kick drum. Somewhere between that 50, you know, maybe as low as 40, you know, 40 to 120 hertz. Somewhere in here, the fundamental of that kick, the low end there, that's where it's going to be. So, and I'm going to go ahead and just kind of that. So if you're finding your kick is lacking that body and that fullness, that's probably the area to boost, right?
Yeah.
But if it's too thumpy, you know, maybe you've got too much sub in your sound selection in context with the rest of the mix, then maybe. Or maybe you're working with like really fast metal double kicks.
Yeah.
You know, maybe we're taking that down a little bit, right? 200 to 500 hertz, I've got listed here as like kind of like the muddy or boxy area. Let's take a listen to that. I'm gonna loop this a little bit quicker. See, it starts to get kind of like, if we boost it, you can hear how that I don't know. There's a the best way I can use to describe it is muddy, right?
Yeah,
Muddy, and then up here it starts to feel or sound like it's kind of like boxy.
totally. It sounds like you're stamping on a cardboard box when you go up to like 400.
Yeah, when we start getting up here.
Yeah.
And there in this particular drum, that's like almost like a resonance that's happening.
Mm.
If we scoop it out on this particular drum, it feels like it's kind of like tightening it up a little bit, right? But none of that matters in solo, right? Again, we're going to keep coming back to that concept. None of that matters in solo. We're just showing you right now, we're just demonstrating what these might sound like on a kick drum. 500 to 1K. Kind of that boxy, kind of like papery sound, right? Kind of like sounding like, when we say boxy, it's like cardboard box, right? Like you said, like cardboard box, kind of like papery. So if you're getting too much of that sound in your recording, you can scoop that out. Right? But if it already sounds good, you do nothing. 2K to 6K. Anywhere in here, if you want more of that sound of the like the beater against the head, like that smack, it's probably somewhere in this area between 2K, 6K. And it starts to get clickier up here, which is the next frequency range, right? 7K and beyond, or 6K and beyond. That'll give you more of that kind of like tappy, clicky metal kick kind of sound, right? So more beater, more smack, and then up here, more click. So those are the key frequency areas to just keep in mind when it comes to a kick drum. Let's check out snare. As high as 150 hertz, that's kind of where the lows and the rumble is. If we take a look at this snare drum, so the lows and the rumble just here as high as 150. So on this particular snare drum, 150 would be too high, right? Because the fundamental is right there. But if you don't want any of that kind of unwanted, if you don't want any of that, that's redundant. If you don't want any of that unwanted rumble, if you don't want any of that rumble, that low end, that's kind of where it lives. Basically anywhere below where that fundamental is.
Yeah. The big spike that you'll see, that is the main meat of the frequency, is where you're going to want to sweep up. I think what's a really good thing is sweeping up to pushing it a little bit and then bringing it back. Sometimes if you're not familiar with using EQ, very, you're not super experienced with it, it's just a really good way for you to start to internalize when you've pushed it a little bit too far, and then when you're just getting rid of the unwanted frequency range. Because there's a tendency sometimes we want to overdo it if we can't quite hear the nuance of how we're changing it. So that could be helpful as well as a technique to start to get a bit more well acquainted with it. Yeah,
so what Chris is talking about is basically that, right? That kind of move where you're rolling it up and then waiting for the drum to get thin or lose its punch and then backing off on it, right? And again, not saying like you have to do this for every single drum or anything like that, but we're giving you the information so that you can make the best call, right, for your own stuff. 250 to 500 hertz is, oh, actually, you know what? Skipped one. 150 to 250 hertz. That's where that fundamental is. That's where that punch is. That's what we're talking about here, right? And we can very clearly see it on the analyzer. It's here. It's actually on this one, it's lower than 150. It's 130, right? Deep snare.
Very.
That's where that like punch is, right? Like right in the chest. Boop, boop. That's too punchy. Back off on it.
In context.
In context.
With the mix.
250 to 500 hertz. We've got that same kind of knock, or boxy or muddy kind of quality there, right? So if you have kind of like, check this out. I will say it is kind of rare that like you need to ever kind of like boost that, but
do it, yeah.
In my experience, but it's usually an area where problems are, you know, typically an area where problems are. So keep an eye out for that. Same thing with this 500 to 1K. And it's funny, like, this is where if your snare starts to sound like that basketball, you know, like that bouncy. I think I use the word bouncy in a lot of kind of describing some of these frequencies for drums. You get that basketball sound, right? So if you're hearing that in context with the rest of the mix, just know that that's probably coming from somewhere in this area, this 500 to 1K area, right? And again, just another area that I typically will just find problems. You know, rarely I'm going to boost that area. Again, depends on the source. 2K to 6K, again, we've got some attack here. So somewhere in here is, let's say your snare isn't like cutting through the mix enough. Well, maybe somewhere in here is that magic frequency for your snare that's gonna kind of poke it through, right? If you got a dense arrangement or if it's competing with a bunch of other stuff, this is kind of the area to look at there. Or maybe you've got too much attack, right? And it's sounding like annoying and it's kind of poking you in the eye a little bit. Then maybe there's something in here that you need to remove. And then we've got this high-end sizzle up at 7K and above, right? Woo!
Ooh, spiky.
Yeah. Right? So if you got too much like snares, maybe, you know, you need to reel those in and darken that snare. Probably a good place to look. So key frequencies for toms. Let's go through these one by one. So continuing to explore these frequency ranges as high as 80 hertz, like lows, rumble. Same idea as the snare drum. It's basically like, hey, look for the fundamental. Anything below that, it's the lows and the rumble of the drum that you can either choose to keep in the arrangement or save on headroom, save that sonic energy, right? Totally up to you. 80 to 200 hertz, that's a fundamental punch, body, fullness. And it's such a wide range because I've kind of grouped these key frequencies. I've grouped the rack tom and the mid tom and the floor toms all kind of together here, right? So you will have to consider the pitch of the drum. The lower the drum is, the lower the frequency or the fundamental is going to be. So on a floor tom, you've got that going on, right? So we've got that fundamental at like 90 hertz. And then on a high tom, like a rack, 120, right? So it's a range there depending on what the pitch of the drum is. And that's what all of these kind of key frequencies are. So next we've got 200 to 500. This is kind of like muddy, again, muddy boxy. I should also add ring here. So there's usually kind of like, this is where the ring of the toms live. Right in that area. 500 to 1K. Another kind of like problem area, very similar to the snare. Honky, bouncy. 2K to 6K. Same as the snare, attack. Starting to hear that stick hit the heads, right? So if you need more attack on those toms, they need to cut through a little bit more, explore this area. And then above that, there's that click. And it's actually pretty rare I even use that on toms, to be honest. Like, it's not the same as a snare where you have the snares and kind of like that sizzle kind of happening on a snare drum. But for toms, if I want more attack, usually just kind of like looking in the upper mids for that.
Yeah, I think it's just about also priority, right? Like it's most common, of course not always, but most common that the main driving force is going to be your kick and snare, right? So we want to pay closer attention to those being at the forefront and punching through, and then our toms typically are going to be adding some fills, adding some ornamentations. Maybe in a bridge we have a breakdown where we have toms, and we want those to kind of sit around the kick and snare. So if we're kind of boosting everything and making everything super attacky, everything's just going to be kind of fighting each other. So we want most often to have kick and snare to be the, you know, really punchy, attacky elements, and then everything else can kind of support that. So we're just, again, being intentional, and we're just thinking about focus and where we're going to be placing things and how we're using the tools to do that.
Next, we've got cymbals, overheads, and room mics. So some key frequencies here, as high as 300 hertz. That's kind of like rumble, lows, and bleed. So let's go to overheads. This area right here, like as high as 300 hertz, sometimes higher even, like this is where all of your low end elements are gonna kind of live. This is where the rumble is. But once we roll off up to 300, we're basically taking out the bleed and the fundamentals of the kick and the snare from those overheads. And again, this is not like do this every time kind of scenario. It depends on what you're going for. If you want the sound of the kick and the snare in the overheads to contribute to the overall sound of the drum kit, then don't high pass this. You know, don't filter this out or anything like that. But if you want the kick and the snare to carry most of that energy and carry most of the tonality of those drums just by themselves, then maybe it makes sense to isolate them. Right? It's all about you making choices, right? You need to make the decisions here. And again, experiment, come to your own conclusions. That's the best way to really know and find out what you're into. 300 to 1K, I find is kind of where that snare will kind of like poke through the overheads. So if you're looking to reduce the sound of the shells, and when I say the shells, I mean the drums in the kit. Like there, we can, the snare kind of is pretty obviously kind of poking through. So if you wanted to kind of reduce that, maybe it's somewhere in this area. Often, I don't think actually I've ever boosted anything in this area for for cymbals, for overheads, or anything like that. Again, this is just kind of like one of those areas that is usually an issue area or a problem area for me. So I'm typically cutting somewhere in there. And then 7K shimmer, or if your cymbals are too harsh, cut back on that. Oh, I need a little bit more shimmer from those cymbals. They need to have that air and that kind of like that sizzle. Well, maybe let's boost that up. If they're sounding a little bit too harsh, like maybe you pumped it up a little bit too much in the recording phase, or just the cymbals are just flat out just too bright, maybe it has to go the other direction.
Something I've learned on my journey of working with drums is there's so much energy in that area, particularly with cymbals. So a little goes a long way. You don't have to push them as far as you may think in some instances. So sometimes being a little more trusting that a lot of that energy is going to carry through, even just with a volume balance. If you've recorded these in an optimal way, then they'll carry a lot of that energy without doing too much in terms of boosting that area. So if you're happy with how you've crafted the sound, don't push them too much. Let them just be, again, supportive. A learning journey for me when I used to push cymbals and hats too far forward.
I think we've all been there. For sure.
Totally.
Like I at least I experienced the same thing. I was always like,
Yeah.
wow, cymbals,
Totally.
and like you actually, in a lot of scenarios, you actually need less than you think. Right?
Oh,
Because
100%.
that high end hits your ear at low volumes, lower volumes than you think.
Exactly.
So it's like
Yeah.
you'll make your life a lot easier if you're kind of like in tune to that. Anyway,
Totally.
just a quick tip. All of those same kind of frequency ranges you can think about on the room mics as well. Right now, taking out all the fundamental, the kick and the snare. Mud, boxiness, right? The drum shells, maybe boxiness from the drums, and then this shimmer or harshness area. Darker room, then brighter room. Add in a little bit of sizzle there. Next, we have drum bus. And I don't know, this maybe was kind of a cop-out, but 20 hertz to 20K.
Free reign over the frequency spectrum.
There you go. Like, you've done all the heavy lifting at this point. You know what I mean? You have all those magic frequencies, and you've kind of sculpted the rest of your kit in terms of the individual tracks. Now it's time to think about just the drum bus as a whole. Right? What does that sound like as a whole? And here it's just kind of like, what does it need? These are subtle moves to sculpt everything, right? Everything in the kit together in context with the rest of
in context.
So we're going to have a chart for you to download so that you have just like access to all of those just as reminders of what to look for and like what to be aware of when it comes to the sonic characteristics of the drums and how they match with the language of frequencies. The Next slide here is the actual blueprint. This is the 3-step blueprint. And some of you might think this is overly simple, but that's the way I like it. I don't like things complicated. I don't like to complicate it. We're human beings. We complicate things enough just naturally, right? we need more clarity and more simplicity. So legit, this blueprint is observe, adjust, and repeat. That's it. That's all it really is. We don't need to make this a crazy kind of system or anything like that. It is observe, listen in context with the rest of the mix, and take notes. Things like, hey, what's the snare doing? Is the snare cutting through enough? Is it not cutting through enough? Is it too boxy? Is it distracting? Is it pulling my ear away from everything else? Is the kick too boomy? Is it not boomy enough? Does it not have enough impact? Is there anything obviously distracting that needs to be fixed? Write it down. Just take notes. We're just listening here. We're not like screwing around with a bunch of things.
Yeah.
My method is to just sit and take note. I'll actually bring up the notepad in Logic and type in the things that I'm hearing, create a little punch list for myself, right? And if you're not sure, then compare with your references.
Yeah.
Let them be the thing that kind of sucks you back in and brings you back home in case you're going too far with things, or you're not sure if the kick needs to click through, or if you want the snare to kick, kind of poke through a little bit more. If you want those cymbals a little bit brighter, use your references to help you make those decisions. Again, we're not trying to copy our references. We're trying to use them as guides to help us make our own decisions for what's best for the track, what's best for the song. Make sense?
Totally.
Anything to add?
It makes such a difference to not touch anything, to not start screwing around with EQ or faders, or because then your brain starts going into action mode rather than analysis mode. So it allows you to just sit back as a listener and then give yourself a blueprint to follow, give yourself steps within the blueprint itself, right? To go, okay, I now know I can attack this with a deeper level of intentionality because I know first I need to do this, then I need to do this, then I need to do that. Then I can stop, I can make a coffee, I can take a break, I can do the same process again, come back, listen, write notes, and then I've got hopefully less notes, and then I do this, I do that, go away, come back, I got one more thing, and then I'm done. Then you can send it to the client, you can listen to it in another environment if that's what you want to do, to see how it's translating, and then go from there, right?
Totally.
It's such a powerful thing to subtract and not do things and just go, okay, let me just listen and see what needs to be done. And I think another part of this is training your ears and listening to a ton of music and mixing a ton of songs. That's how you're going to know what to do. So Jake's saying if you're not sure, compare with your references, and you're going to start to internalize when things may be slightly off base and when things are just right and you don't need to do anything. It all just comes with experience and with commitment to the craft, right?
100%. 100%. Well said, dude. Yeah. I mean, so after we actually do this observing and with hands off, right? Then you adjust. You go in, you've got your punch list now, you've got your notes. You go in and you adjust accordingly. Again, I'm not going to tell you boost this, cut this, high pass this, shelf this, blah 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 blah. You get to make those your own choices. You get to make those decisions, right? And now you know how to make those decisions. And you know what areas of the frequency spectrum to address in order to get yourself closer to where you want to be. So I just leave this here as boost and cut accordingly in context, not in solo. And then what Chris said, repeat that process. You've done that once, stand up, do a few jumping jacks, sit back down, do it again, right? And you can do this a few different ways. You know, some people find it helpful to do this process for each separate piece of the kit, right? So, hey, this round, I'm going to observe what's going on with the kick drum. Then next round, I'm going to observe what's going on with the snare drum. And then I'm going to focus in on the toms. So that can be a nice way to kind of break up each kind of section of the kit. You can do it that way. Some people have success doing it that way. Another way is you can do multiple rounds for the entire kit where you're giving yourself the opportunity to just listen to every single instrument, what pops out at you in the moment. Go with your gut, you know. Oh, the kick is getting buried, the snare is this, the toms are that, the cymbals are this, and writing down everything that you hear for every instrument in the kit. But if that's too complex, then go to the other way for each separate piece of the kit. You could also break it up even more and say, hey, I really want to focus on the kick and the snare now and really get that kick snare relationship dialed in, right? I'm going to compare my kick snare to my references. I'm going to listen to, like, really focus on my kick snare in context with everything else, dial that in, take a little, you know, breather, do a couple push-ups, come back, you know, get to the next toms, get to the cymbals, get to the room mics, blah, 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 right? So what do you think? Do you want to just, like, quickly demonstrate?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, I think so. Observe,
Let's
adjust,
do it. Yeah,
repeat.
let's do a round of this as a demonstration.
Yeah, that sounds good. This is a track by Christiana Alaire. This is unmixed. This is completely unmixed. This is just a volume balance for everything. And, you know, we did a phase alignment a little bit earlier with the drums. So I'm just going to listen, and I'm going to use the notepad inside of Logic to just take some notes. And if you want to do this while I'm doing it at the same time and take your own notes, that's totally cool, just as like a practice thing. And write down what you're hearing and what you would like to hear more of, and create basically your own punch list as we're going through this and listening to this chorus together. Here we go.
'Cause what I've been taking is no setbacks, and I was picking them up out like heaven, surrounded and lust could have fooled me. Yeah, I thought it was love, they were pretty until I found thorns, and I was sleeping in the bed that I made, and there's no one else to blame, and now I've had it, oh, I've had enough. I was picking them up like I was building a bouquet of roses.
So these sound really good to me. So I had very few notes, just like from my gut,
Yeah.
but let's check them against some references. And I'm using a plugin here called Reference from a company called Mastering the Mix. This is my favorite referencing plugin. What I'll do here is go to Spotify and pick out a few references if I'm, you know, working on something of my own. If I'm working on something for a client, I will ask them for the references, right? That's how you get to know what their, you know, what their vision is and what kind of like they're going for. Know your target there, right? So I've got a Miranda Lambert song, and then I've got a Megan Moroney song. Miss Universe's Megan Moroney. So let's take a listen. Let's kind of compare these back and forth. And it's really easy with this plugin. You just flip from original to reference. Here we go.
'Cause what I've been taking is no setbacks, and I was picking them up out my come out in the wild. Every little stain, every little heartbreak, no matter how I'm thorns, and I was sleeping.
So different, right? The drum
Yeah.
tone and just like the tonality of the entire mix is really, really different. This is why I picked this for an example, to show the differences between the mixes, right? Now, if a client gave me this as a reference and said, hey, I really want to kind of like stick to the sound of this Miranda Lambert song, then we would have some heavy lifting to do on these drums, right? They're grittier.
'Cause what a wild, it
You know, that sounds like they're kind of overdriven, right? There's like some
Yeah,
saturation
there's a lot
there.
of saturation on them. Yeah.
Totally, totally. And they're less clear, you know, just the mix as a whole is just kind of like it's got a little bit more of this gritty kind of sound to it. Then let's bop over to Megan Maroney.
'Cause what I've been taking is those red flags, and I was picking 'em up out my bar drinking while she's in a magazine. Hate her like hell, but hell, it could have been worse. At least my whole mate, and there's no one else to blame, and my whole back home.
So really woofy kick drum there, right? And the snare is pointy and really punchy. You know, it's less of that kind of like heavier snare, and it's more
Yeah.
of that kind of like in your face, almost like probably it's likely there's like a sample layered in under there too to just like kind of
Yeah.
give you that 200 hertz kind of punch, right? So, you know, there's differences. Not all drums are created equal. Your client is going to help you determine where to go with your drums. Or if you're not, you know, working with somebody else, it's your own music, then it's important to get drums or excuse me, it's important to get references with the drum sound that you're going for and take that into consideration early on in the process. Take that into consideration in recording, in production first, right? So really this is a lesson on referencing in those phases
Totally.
first before you even get to mixing, because then when you're in mixing, it's not about sound design or anything like that. It's not about making these drastic changes. It's about just kind of like oogieing things closer to where you want them to be, right? So all of that being said, we can just make decisions about these drums now. Like I just pulled these out for examples sake, you know, for a teaching demonstration. For me, you know, I think just ultimately if we're going for like a clean kind of sound, these are the things that I would kind of address here, right? And a little bit of my taste is coming into the equation here too. And I actually put this in a question mark because I don't actually know. I don't know what that's going to sound like until I actually test it out in context.
'Cause what I've been taking is those red flags, and I was picking 'em up out like heaven, surrounded and lust could have fooled me. Yeah, I thought it was love, they were pretty until I found thorns, and I was sleeping in the bed that I made, and there's no one else to blame, and now
I had less low end on the snare here, but I don't think I'm even going to touch the snare, honestly. I think it sounds good where it's sitting. And then I've got more attack on toms. We know from knowing our key frequencies that the attack on toms, it's going to be somewhere in here. So I'm just going to kind of boost this in context and see where they kind of poke out. How's that for you?
Can use that as a new sample for another song.
Yeah. So just so you can hear like the kind of move that we did. That clickiness. And I want to add a little bit more of that to the low end. Or I'm sorry, the tom low. Floor tom. Nice. If we just solo these drums. Yeah, and you can just hear what it sounds like. And if you want me to exaggerate that, I can. Hear the difference? And it sounds like you know, arguably not that great. And when we just solo that track, right? But in context with everything else, no, we got toms that are just like clicking through, right? There's attack there happening. Hearing that? Hearing the toms cutting through the mix, cutting through the density of those electric guitars. Cool. And that's the last item on my punch list. Now, we take a breather. Cool. Okay. And we jump back in. And we listen again. We listen in context, and then we compare with the references to see where we want to go. Hopefully that makes sense. Anything to add there, Chris?
If your productions don't sound like this in terms of how close they are to the final sound you want to go for, then you're going to want to go back and revisit some sound selection, revisit some recording, and really explore what it is that you're going for and reference while you're producing to give yourself that objective kind of measure for the style you want to go for, so that you don't go to a mix engineer and then feel disappointed that they're just giving you an enhanced version of what you've done, because that's essentially what our job is just to enhance and present what you've done in the best possible light, not to change it. We're not trying to change anything here. So it's just a really important thing to remember.
Yeah, I mean, and hopefully you guys are absorbing this. I mean, you said it very, very well, Chris. Like, we're as mixing engineers, we're not meant to be sound design engineers. So we're not meant to produce the sound, overly produce the sound of the drums and completely drastically change things. We want to execute the artist's vision that was already established in the production and in the recording session, right? I think that's the healthiest mindset to really kind of take away here. But yeah, just to double down on that concept, get it right at the source, and you won't even have to do a whole bunch of EQ later on down the line. Now, when you do get to mixing and you are using EQ in that phase, now you have a blueprint. Now you have a very, very simple process to follow. And now you know that this isn't sound design. This is just kind of oogieing things in the right direction, right? It's just kind of like pushing things and enhancing things and making what's already there better. Make sense? Cool?
Yeah.
So action items. We are trying this new format for the channel, and hopefully it is resonating with you guys. We really just kind of want to be like the I don't want to say anti-YouTube because we do love this platform for like information and stuff like that. What I don't love the platform for is like quick tips, tricks without context, right? Without healthy mindset, so want to try to give you healthier mindset and healthier kind of advice and holistic advice when it comes to music production, creating music, so that you can really just move forward with confidence in this thing. So here are your action items. We're going to have action items at the end of our lessons and our videos now. So your action items are to download the drum EQ chart. There's going to be a link in the description for that. So it's just going to have all those key frequencies that we talked about. You're going to download the practice multi-tracks, and we're going to include references. Thirdly, you'll EQ the drums to the best of your ability. You'll put in the work, put in the practice, implement what you've learned. Anything to add? Any final thoughts, Chris?
The actions are how you're going to implement this information and actually start to internalize it. So don't just skip and go, oh yeah, I get it. Do the action items. Do the process of applying this so that you know how to navigate these tools and you start to broaden your skills in this area. Just do your best. And it might take a couple of goes. It might take you longer than it took Jake, but that's the process. And it will get quicker. You'll start to build more instinct, and then you'll just get better at your craft. And then it's going to be a lot easier.
And if you want to see full mixes and get like really in the weeds with stuff, make sure you join the membership program. Lots of coursework and mentorship, actual mentorship where you can get music reviews, you can get feedback for what you're working on. We'll have a link for that as well. All right, we'll shut it down for today. Thanks, guys. We'll see you in the next one. Peace.